What up, people? Most of you know me as Freaky Flow, but I recently wrote a book under my real name, Stephen Aaron Gray. My book's called Ant Farm, and I hope you'll enjoy these first 4 chapters, which you're now about to listen to completely for free. If you do like them, though, I certainly hope you'll consider buying the full book. You can find more details on stephenaarongray.com or antfarmbook.com. Anyway, a lot of people have been asking me, you're a DJ. Why did you write a book that has nothing to do with music at all? Well, the answer's simple, really. Even though I love music, it's not the only thing I'm interested in, and it's not the only thing I've spent a lot of time learning about. During all those years on the road, playing events around the world, I've taken special notice about how different societies function under different conditions. I lived in Canada for almost 30 years, and I've lived in the US for the last 5 years too. Of course, I haven't been everywhere, so I've supplemented my own eyewitness experiences with many hours of reading and listening about different global cultures and civilizations. But through all of this, I've come to one ultimate conclusion. When you let people live their lives freely, things just tend to turn out better. But when you try to control people and force them to do things against their wills, even if you mean well, unfortunately, things tend to turn out worse. Like I said, I've read a lot of books and listened to a lot of lectures about these kinds of subjects, but almost all of them have been dry, data-filled, non-fiction pieces. Many of them are great, but they're hard to digest if you've never dealt with these kinds of topics before. I wanted to write something that would introduce the ideas of freedom and liberty to the average Joe, to people who don't care much about being progressive or conservative, to people who haven't really ever taken much interest in things beyond music or art or film. Because even though music, art, and film are extremely valuable and important, these things alone can't dramatically reduce world poverty, disease, and suffering. And to me, that's more important in the grand scheme of things. So, how was I going to do this? How was I going to write a philosophy book that average people, and even young adults, could relate to? Well, I thought back to my 8th grade English class in junior high school, and I remembered a book that we had to read back then called Animal Farm by George Orwell. If you remember, Orwell's Animal Farm is a book about a bunch of animals that take over a farm and try to run it with each of them being considered equal to everyone else. I didn't realize it until we discussed it openly in class, but this was Orwell's way of introducing the ideas and problems of state-sponsored communism to average people and young adults. Back then, I had heard the word communism before, but I didn't really know much about it until I read his book and discussed it with people. Well, years later, when I was trying to figure out how to write my own book, this seemed like a great model. If I wanted to talk about freedom and liberty to people, and how forced control creates all kinds of problems, maybe I could talk about these ideas through a similar frame. For me, this was the genesis of the concept for my book, Ant Farm. My book uses ants instead of farm animals, but I still aim to introduce people to philosophy, even if my philosophy is, in many ways, very different from Orwell's. So you'll certainly notice intentional similarities between my book and his, but I think you'll also notice some dramatic and very intentional differences too. With that said, I hope you'll enjoy these first 4 chapters. So without further delay, let's begin.
Publisher Page presents the unabridged recording of Ant Farm, written and read by Stephen Aaron Gray.
Ant Farm, a novel about what's bugging society. Thank you to George Orwell for providing a structure in which to tell this tale. Thank you to those who pursue liberty for inspiring the content with which to fill that structure. Viewed from within, the colony is like a factory enclosed in a fortress. Auster and Wilson, 20. Chapter 1. Ant Farm Statistics, Rates per Thousand. Date, January 1st, 1904. Population, 0. Average lifespan, not available. Unemployment, not available. Total tax rate, not available. Cost of one berry, not available. Annual violent crime, not available. Annual nonviolent crime, not available. Prime Minister Antony Leopold Whut, of the esteemed ruling white cockroach family, stood at the podium, grinding his many legs together with a shrill sound, looking as if in anticipation of food. His presence was frightening. His large family represented the only remaining cockroaches left in the nation. Here, grotesque as ever, he issued a new decree, bayonet in his thick hand. No ant would be permitted to leave the nation of Great Antlin without a Great Antlin permit to leave. To obtain said permit, an ant must first pay the requisite fee of 200 Great Antlin antlers. Next, an ant must undergo an extensive interview with the Great Antlin Permission to Leave Commission. If approved, an ant must pay a second exit tax. It was all very bureaucratic, but also largely academic, since most ants were denied permission to exit during the first step, after paying the fee, of course. In fact, only 2.3% of applicants had been granted permission to exit since Prime Minister Whut's decree had been issued 3 months prior, and most of those ants had curried favor with members of Anthony Whut's administration. By and large, resident ants of Great Antlin had essentially become prisoners in their own nation under harsh white cockroach supervision. Battalions of hideous, seething cockroaches, clad in white uniforms, had marched in unison through the streets of Great Antlin for years now, striking fear in the hearts of resident, subject ants. The original purpose of these battalions, it had been preached, had been to monitor and punish criminal activity and protect the antlish from dangerous intruders, both foreign and domestic. But today, for the first time, these battalions patrolled the exits of Great Antlin, grinding their many legs together like their leader, ensuring the Prime Minister's new decree would be adhered to. Escape now would be nearly impossible, and by gosh, how so many ants wanted desperately to escape. Just walking the streets, one could not avoid the sights, sounds, and smells of misery. Their money nearly worthless now, hordes of ants hauled giant sacks of Great Antlin antlers across town, for many of their vehicles had broken down or fallen apart, just to pay for breadcrumbs. But these breadcrumbs themselves were sparse and growing sparser. It was not uncommon for an ant to wait 3, 4, sometimes even 5 hours in line to make a purchase. And that was if there were even breadcrumbs or milk drops still available by the time the front of the line could be reached. And often enough, there were not, as massive food shortages began to spread throughout the country. Schooling was paid for by their government, but the schools themselves were so rife with violence nowadays that many parents kept their children home just for the very safety of the young ones. Otherwise, they kept their children home to put them to work, secretly, for the vile white cockroaches did not approve of youth labor, so they could afford the extra money just to provide a few meager breadcrumbs for themselves. It didn't matter anyway what an ant might learn in class. Young ants were no longer permitted to choose their own vocations. Rather, Prime Minister Antony Leopold Whut's hulking, vicious cockroach guards would barge into classrooms during the final few days of seniors' lessons and drag away, for military service, the larger and stronger ants, who often kicked and screamed on their way into their transport cages. The seemingly more fortunate and more meager, or smarter, ants were left behind to be collected a few days later by the Intellectual Cockroach Committee, who would place said ants into fields like construction, retail, or medicine, depending on each ant's test scores. But these ants found themselves miserable also. With the strongest ants serving in the armed forces, slowly but forcefully expanding the borders of Great Antlin, the more meager construction ants, though smart, were not strong enough to do as much of the heavy lifting as was required. They did their very best, of course, for fear of being beaten by their ruthless cockroach masters, but even their very best efforts led to shoddy machinery in buildings. Several ants, and even a few cockroaches, were now dying every day, crushed in faulty vehicles and squished in collapsing structures. The few ants in retail were relieved to be there, having dodged the literal bullets and collapse of military and construction, respectively. But their own quiet misery still seeped into their own work. Many would put up a facade of hard work for their white cockroach masters, But a facade was all this was. Most ants did only enough work to go unnoticed as incompetent. Few ants went above and beyond the call of duty to truly please customers. Take-home pay for the retail ants was, after all, the same amount, whether the customers were satisfied or not. The even fewer ants who practiced medicine were also relieved to avoid the near certain death or injury that awaited the others in the military and in construction. However, happy was not a word that could accurately describe their demeanors. They were miserable. Most of these ants were certified doctors against their own wills, simply because the cockroaches had deemed them the smartest of the lot. As it turned out, many were poor surgeons, and some were even queasy at the sight of blood. But to the cockroaches, this mattered not. The doctors would either do their jobs, or else they would be punished, in an increasingly more violent fashion. The pressure climaxed when a poor, shaky-handed ant doctor, with 2 white cockroaches closely observing him, was charged with the difficult task of adding a precise amount of medicine to Great Antlin's central water supply. One of the cockroaches coughed, which sounded more like an icy shriek coming from a cockroach, and startled the ant doctor, who accidentally spilled a poisonous amount of medicine into the water supply. Alarm sounded and the plant was shut down, but not before some of the water leaked out into the waterways and made its way to the mouths of the general public. The ant doctor was immediately executed, impaled, by the coughing white cockroach for this blunder, but more than 10,000 additional ants were also unintentionally sentenced to death by poison shortly after the tainted water touched their lips. To avoid widespread panic, Prime Minister Antony Leopold Whut's cockroaches did their very best to keep this information a secret, by force and by fraud, but despite their best efforts, 10,000 sudden deaths were too many. The information still spread, and ants still found out. This was the final straw for several. The stench of death, the sight of decrepit buildings, and the overall sense of desolation could not be avoided. Tonight, mauve ants, gold ants, silver ants, cross ants, green ants, yellow ants, pink ants, brown ants, purple ants, violet ants, orange ants, spotted ants, striped ants, indigo ants, and countless other ant clans gathered in a secret, dank hole to discuss a plan of escape from the land many of them had once loved. Glancing first at his wristwatch, and well aware of the battalion's patrol schedule, Anton Indigo spoke with haste, yet still calmly, as usual. "Ants," he began. "I look before me and see—" He paused. "At least 1,000 of you gathered here. Probably closer to 1,300. A few ants coughed. "And I know you have gathered here because you seek the same thing I do. Freedom." Several ants now muttered in the crowd, but Anton Indigo continued, holding back tears. "Freedom from the oppression of this government that has grown and grown since its inception hundreds of years ago. Make no mistake, Prime Minister Antony Leopold Whut has eroded our freedoms even further, but not in an increment any greater than the Prime Minister before Antony Whut, or the Prime Minister before that Prime Minister, and so forth. Today, I'm barely permitted to walk down the road in a manner that I wish, wearing what I want to, and most of you have 3/4 of your work earnings confiscated by the government every year, if you even live to see that year's end at all. To those of us who wish to live as free ants," he checked his watch again, "it is time to leave Antlin." Andrea Violet stepped delicately to the podium's sandhill, briefly adjusted the glasses on her face, and spoke next. She was scared, but excited. "We will leave tonight." A rustling excitement bustled in the audience, but the ants dared not cheer. Government cockroaches were patrolling the hills, always watching, enforcing state curfew. "But leave with me only if you desire total liberty as I do. Only if you will vow to never initiate aggressive physical force or fraud against your neighbor, not even in the slightest, for any reason whatsoever. That's what started this whole mess many years ago. To motivate you during this journey, and indeed, even after we have arrived, I have composed a song. Very quietly, I will sing you that song now. I am not a fantastic vocalist, and I must remain relatively quiet, but when I have taught you the tune, you can sing it better for yourselves. It is called Ants of Freedom." Andrea Violet cleared her throat and began to sing. As she had indicated, she sang quietly and carefully, but she sang well enough, and it was a stirring tune, something between YMCA and hip-hop hooray. The words ran, Ants of freedom, ants of liberty, ants of every free desire, hearken to my joyful tidings of a land where none conspire, to rule over us, to control us, to make us do what they wish, to a land where no more tyrants tax a portion of your dish. We shall all own our own land, and no ant tells us what to do, and your lives, oh once again ants, will be owned by only you. Times may be harsh, winter's weary, but we'll pitch in when we can. But not more than we can afford, it's a choice for every ant. Watch production double, triple, when we each control our means. No more working under slavery, while taskmasters apply liens. For that day we must escape soon, else we accept our own chains. Ants of youth and ants of elder, you can end the thankless pains. Ants of freedom, ants of liberty, ants of every free desire, hearken to my joyful tidings of a land where none conspire. The singing of this song threw the ants into the wildest excitement, and Andrea Violet's fear subsided momentarily. Almost before she had reached the end, they had begun singing it for themselves, though careful not to sing at such a loud volume that would put them in harm's way. 100 ants, inspired by the song and its message, but fearing the wrath of Great Antlin's government, stayed behind. Another 100 or so more feared the chaos they believed would result from the new society Ant and Indigo and Andrea Violet spoke of, that it might be even worse than Antlin. But when the Exodus, as they called it, neared, the Liberty Ant movement was still over 1,000 strong, large enough to offer hope amongst themselves, but small enough to slip through Antlin's expansive armed guard by cover of night. Thus, ant societies do not differ much from human societies in the appointment of time devoted to labor and idleness. Holdobler and Wilson, 342. Chapter 2. Ant Farm Statistics, Rates per Thousand. Date, January 3, 1904. Population, 1,017. Average lifespan, 72 years. Unemployment, not available. Total tax rate, 0.00%. Cost of one berry, not available. Annual violent crime, not available. Annual nonviolent crime, not available. For 2 days, the ants had trekked through the desert, spontaneously breaking into ants of freedom whenever they had enough energy. They finally came upon the desolate, unclaimed ant farm one of the Violet Ant Scouts had identified a few weeks earlier. Now, on their first day here, some of the ants had already grown restless and hungry. One of the plaid ants even assaulted a brown ant with a blunt sand grain, because the brown ant had a delicious half-berry the plaid ant had wanted. Noticing this scuffle, both the broad-shouldered Ryant Crimson and the agile, athletic Antgela Navy broke up the fight and subdued the plaid thug. Ryant Crimson's close friend, Melvant Red, though tall and gangling, also jumped in to assist. Not far behind him was the contrastingly short and portly Williant Blue, a former colleague of Angela Navy's back in Antlin. Immediately, Allant Cross, a great Antland certified surgeon prior to the Exodus, stethoscope always around his neck, adjusted his monocle and swooped in to rescue the injured brown ant. Later that day, when Ryant Crimson and Angela Navy had a moment to reflect on the day's events, out of earshot of the others, Angela Navy made a confession. "Ryant Crimson," she said, "how are we going to maintain any kind of order if this is the kind of thing already happening on the first day of our departure? Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. I hate to admit it, and please don't tell the others, but I'm scared." "Fear not," replied Ryant Crimson. "You saw how we dealt with things today, yes? The incident was minimal. Whatever comes our way, nothing will ever be worse than what we just escaped from." That did the trick, and Angela Navy's nerves calmed. Within the next few days, at least 4 new upstart services had begun. First, Ryant Crimson started Crimson Security Forces and, incidentally, flexed his powerful muscles any time he talked about it. A few dozen ants were already paying him with food and services in exchange for security around their new homesteads. Several Crimson ants assisted Ryant Crimson, for due compensation, of course. But Melvant Red, a good friend of Ryant Crimson's, helped spread the word of Ryant Crimson's services free of charge. After all, he insisted, this is what good friends do. Second, although a bit reluctant about this decision privately, Angela Navy launched Navy Protection in direct competition with Crimson security forces. She too gave off an air of power, and although she didn't have the hulking presence of her competitor, she was more than capable. Though slightly more nervous by nature, she was ultimately a more playful ant and could frequently be seen tossing a ball up and down in the air as she strolled about town, a calming technique. She did consider Ryant Crimson to be a friend of hers, but she saw a business opportunity here and jumped at it. An ant with less pride would have welcomed the competition, but Ryant Crimson instead ended the long-standing friendship between the two and almost burst a blood vessel in his forehead when he found out. No matter to Angela Navy, though, for she had her own cheering section, led by her own longtime chubby chum, Williant Blue. Third, Alan Cross continued to call himself a doctor, as he had been called back in Antland. Several dozen ants had sustained mild illnesses or fatigue during the exodus, and they offered Dr. Alan Cross sufficient edible reward. One ant, a carpenter, even offered to upgrade Alan Cross's homestead, in exchange for medical treatment. Sometimes ants would even catch him about town and ask for an examination right then and there. No problem for Dr. Alan Cross, though, who was always prepared with that stethoscope around his neck. "I'm just relieved to be able to help ants again," he confided to Angela Navy during a dinner party, "without the white cockroaches breathing down my neck like they used to. It's like a huge weight has been lifted from my shoulders, and I can finally make ants truly feel better. How exciting!" Fourth, noticing it was laborious and complicated for ants to pay other ants with berries, wood scraps, and promissory notes for carpentry services, and recognizing nobody here would accept great Antland Antlar banknotes, Jonathan Gold, a wise but frail ant who had specialized in mining back in Antland, began selling standardized units of rare gold specks, or gold specks, as he called them, which he had begun to mine for. Ants flocked to him, for it was easier to pay Dr. Alan Cross for a foot examination with 2 gold specks than it was to pay him by dragging 2 giant berries across Ant Farm, provided Dr. Alan Cross would even accept gold specks as payment. And that he did, always with a smile, always adjusting that strange monocle over his right eye. Before winter was over, many more security firms emerged, and many more ants were paying valuable gold specks for protection against the occasional thug who might resort to theft or assault. But they were now paying silver specks too, mined and sold by Canta Silver, and copper specks mined by Joe Ant Copper, and some even paid by wood specks or glass specks or berry specks. Though many ants began to shy away from accepting the perishable and not-so-rare specks, since these types of specks would decompose and become worthless before long, unlike the competing metal specks. "This variety is fantastic," exclaimed Joe Ant Copper. "Will my copper specks be able to compete with silver specks and gold specks? I certainly think so, but even if I'm wrong, this variety alone is a welcome change from those worthless great Antland antlars we all had to use for so many years." She smiled. In the months that followed, many ants decided even gold specks, silver specks, copper specks, and various other metal and material specks also became too heavy to drag across the farm. And so, Jonathan Gold, the wise founder of the Gold Speck Company, started a new division of his business. To whomever of his customers made the request, Jonathan Gold would issue highly tamper-proof gold speck paper certificates, or representative notes, reminiscent of Great Antland Antlar banknotes, but with one key difference. Any time one of his customers would enter Jonathan Gold's office with a 5 gold speck paper representative note, upon the customer's request, Jonathan Gold, frail as ever, would carefully emerge from his chair, take the note from the customer, and give that customer 5 actual, physical, shiny gold specks in exchange. Great Antland banknotes, at least in recent history, had not offered an equivalent service and were, in reality, backed by no physical commodity that held any value to any ant. Jonathan Gold, on the other hand, always made sure if he had issued 76,896 total gold speck paper representative notes cumulatively to all of his customers, as was the case currently, that he, in point of fact, actually had 76,896 physical, shiny specks of gold contained within the vaults at his offices. The wisdom of his good idea did not go unnoticed. Ants were flocking to Jonathan Gold in light of this new advancement. To compete, owners of the silver speck, copper speck, wood speck, berry speck, and other monetary companies soon made this transition to paper representative notes backed by the commodities they represented as well. However, by year's end, Only the gold speck, copper speck, and silver speck remained in business. Wood, berries, and other commodities indeed rotted and became undesirable to most ants as reliable forms of currency. Also by year's end, several new security firms were flourishing too, now competing with the Crimson and Navy security/protection companies. Some owners, like Charcoal Security's fast-talking and well-intentioned Jason Charcoal, wanted desperately to liberate other ants around the world from tyrants, just as he had liberated himself from the oppression in Antland, and he would stop at nothing to make this happen. "I just want to give them the same chance I now have," he said. "It's not right that other ants around the world are being held in captivity, some in even worse conditions than even I had to endure back under white cockroach rule. My clients and I have to do something about it." For this task, he had to increase the monthly fees to his customers. But most didn't mind because this money was going to such a noble cause, and because he spoke so fast and convincingly. Within weeks, Charcoal Security's special operation teams had rescued about 19 ants in Panama and Somaliant, and they were now living on Ant Farm. With this success came more ants voluntarily offering their support, switching from Navy and Crimson Security over to Charcoal Security. To curb this trend and stop hemorrhaging business, Ryan Crimson, flexing his thick, broad arms in anger, decided to assemble his own special operations teams, also demanding and receiving higher prices from customers, and then similarly performing strong humanitarian work in Panama and Somaliant. When Ryant Crimson's rescue numbers grew to 68 ants, many of Charcoal Security's customers switched back to Crimson Security, which was clearly doing a better job. Well, Jason Charcoal, not to be outdone, would not stand for this, and his tunnel vision took over. He assembled a massive new special operations team, armed them with the most technologically advanced equipment available on the farm, and prepped them for their next mission into Somaliant. He was pleased. "Special Operations Team," he began, pausing for only a split second before rushing out more words to his staff. "I am charging you with the task of noble humanitarian aid. On your next mission to Somaliant, it is imperative you rescue as many ants as possible, no matter what measures need to be taken. By hell or high water, we will liberate ants." A month later, the team returned with 79 rescued ants to their credit. However, Ryant Crimson had covertly embedded one of his own staff members on Charcoal's special operations team. During the mission, this staff member had taken photographs that revealed a horrifying truth. Yes, 79 ants had been rescued, but Charcoal Security's special operations team had unintentionally killed 188 innocent Somali ants in the process, while Jason Charcoal simply looked the other way. Ryant Crimson was no fool. He quickly publicized this major blunder. Before long, more than half of Charcoal Security's customers switched over to Crimson Security. They didn't want the blood of innocent ants on their hands. Crimson Security, and soon Navy Protection too, continued calculated, occasional humanitarian rescue missions. But, learning a valuable lesson from the massive mistake made by Charcoal Security, they were extremely careful about the loss of innocent life. As it turned out, this massive mistake proved too large for Charcoal Security to recover from. Jason Charcoal's operating expenses were too high, and his customer base was now too small to continue. He had no choice but to close his company down, slowing down his enthusiasm for the first time in a long while. "I didn't mean to kill so many innocents," he cried, genuinely regretful of what he and his company had done. "I was just trying to help. My original intentions were good." But it was too late. The ants had made up their minds, and Jason Charcoal suffered the consequences of his actions. Other security companies disbanded too, but their employees and owners found other work, just as Jason Charcoal eventually did, when his spirits were back up. With the ant farm population hovering around only 1,500 inhabitants, the market had determined that no more than 3 security forces were financially viable at this time, including Angela Navy's, Ryant Crimson's, and one additional small firm. The others, like Jason Charcoal's, went out of business for one reason or another. One of these out-of-business ants in particular was Stanton Orange. A stubborn fellow with a sharp bow tie, Stanton Orange had once received rudimentary medical training. Thus, while contemplating a new career, he decided to compete with the community's only doctor so far, Alan Cross. Not surprisingly, Alan Cross was not pleased. However, knowing full well he was not trained for open heart surgery as Alan Cross had been, Stanton Orange decided voluntarily to not perform complex medical procedures for fear of accidentally killing an ant and facing the wrath of that ant's family, not to mention the expected ostracization from the entire community. He did not want his career to end before it had hardly begun. Instead, ants with mild ailments could now pay 6 gold specks, or their equivalent representative notes, to the established Dr. Alan Cross for a 30-minute examination. His shiny medical instrument dangling from his neck seemed to justify the cost. Or they could pay 3 gold specks, or their representative notes, to the more amateur Dr. Stanton Orange, as he now called himself, for an examination of the same duration from a lesser qualified ant in a bow tie. Some ants paid 6 for the first, others paid 3 for the second. The choice was theirs. At the start of the new year, most ants stopped referring to gold spec representative notes as gold spec representative notes and just called these notes gold specks directly, since that is what they represented anyway. Additionally, silver specks and copper specks began to fall to the wayside next to the popular gold spec. Some ants still used and accepted the fringe currencies, but more and more, the gold spec was just naturally becoming the community standard, since this was the type of currency, it turned out, most ants preferred to voluntarily use. Further, more doctors were emerging in the market, giving Alan Cross and Stanton Orange both a run for their gold specks. Some of these new doctors proved to be fraudulent, and several ants got very ill as a result. Sadly, a few ants even died. But once word got out about the fraudulent doctors, few patients ever transacted with said doctors again, and most went out of business. "You know I'm a credible doctor," Alan Cross pleaded to the community. "Don't risk your life by putting it in some other ant's hands. I may cost a little more, but I'm more skilled and I care more about your lives." Seeing an opportunity for revenue here, Manton Plaid, a scheming ant, and Sylviant Speckle, a simple ant, both independently, within a week of one another, developed consumer certification companies. Each had different standards for granting a business their respective seals of approval, and both worked well. In time, some patients refused to patronize a doctor without a plaid seal, and others refused doctors without a speckle seal. A couple of less reputable doctors forged these seals, but they were soon discovered, outed, and discredited as a result. A couple of fraudulent upstart consumer certification companies also emerged, but once the public became aware these seals were meaningless, these certification companies, and the businesses they certified, also closed their doors. Alan Cross sought and received a plaid seal of approval, and Stanton Orange a speckle seal. True, several more ants became sick while deceived by others, but it didn't take long for most ants to distinguish the reputable seals from the not-so-reputable. Occasionally, an ant might be surprised to see a doctor's office emerge without any seal at all. Such doctors would generally only charge 1 or half a gold speck for an examination. Some of the poorer ants, or the more frugal ones, became customers, but they did so knowingly at their own risk. Still, certification costs were so inexpensive that even most of the poor ants could afford to visit a certified doctor. Many of the single-spec medical offices, as they came to be known, turned out to be fairly safe anyway, for even though they were not ordained with a plaid, speckle, or other reputable seal, many months of strong business without incident was enough to win them favorable reputations, so they had enough customers to afford to carry on business. The bottom line was that, on Ant Farm, ants either took it upon themselves to investigate companies they would patronize, or else they paid an external, profit-driven company to investigate, by way of certification, on their behalf. The ants knew if they didn't look out for themselves, nobody would, and so they did so with extremely high standards, in the interest of their own well-being and safety. "It takes a little more work here for me to find the right trustworthy doctor," said Anton Indigo to Andrea Violet over lunch one day. "But it's so nice to have options and ultimately to be healthy again." Days later, perhaps it was an angry ant the speckle certification company had refused to certify, or perhaps it was simply a random act of vandalism. But one morning, Kimberlette Speckle, vice president of speckle certification, walked into her office, pleasantly humming Ants of Freedom to herself, and gasped when she noticed it had been robbed. "I haven't felt so violated since we left Great Antland," she exclaimed. She immediately wrote down all of the details of her surroundings. She had been paying a monthly security fee to Ryant Crimson's company, and so Ryant Crimson himself walking with power and authority, came by to investigate the matter. For days, he and his team searched diligently for the culprit, but alas, they were unable to solve the crime. Not ready to give up so soon, Kimberlent Speckle thanked Ryan Crimson for his attempts and proceeded to contact Angela Navy, who was Ryan Crimson's biggest competitor. "Angela Navy," began Kimberlent Speckle during their first meeting, "as you well know, my office was robbed and I just don't feel safe. My regular security company has been unable to solve this crime. I propose to you the following scenario. If you are able to locate the culprit, on that day, I will cancel my monthly subscription to Ryan Crimson's company and instead sign up immediately with you." "Well, this is highly irregular," replied Angela Navy, tossing her ball up and down from one hand to the next. But alas, her security business was having some financial trouble, and she could use a new customer and a chance to prove she could outshine Ryan Crimson with her more agile, adaptive approach. I agree to these terms. With careful sleuthing and using different crime-solving techniques than those which Ryan Crimson had used, Angela Navy was able to apprehend the thief in only 4 days. She smiled a sly grin. Kimberlent Speckle kept her word, as one might expect from such a simple, honest ant, and, on that very day, she canceled her contract with Ryan Crimson and initiated a new contract with Angela Navy. The burly, always dirty Stephen Yellow had also decided to hire Angela Navy's security company, but for an entirely different reason. Stephen Yellow, who, with his entire family, had been in the construction business back in Great Antland, decided to transpose these skills into building sustainable roads here on Ant Farm. For this task, he needed to covertly purchase construction equipment from Antland and required security services from Angela Navy, or rather, the 20 armed ants she had assigned to this project, in order to ensure safe passage. Sure enough, Stephen Yellow's contact back in Antland, a different yellow ant, who happened to be his own cousin, helped the transaction come to pass without any incident, and Stephen Yellow got his already dirty hands even grimier the very next day when he began construction on roads. To make this happen, he purchased small pieces of property in front of the homesteads of several ants. These small pieces of property, all strung together, provided the perfect space on which to build roads. Some ants realized they could ask for a lot of money for this property, and Stephen Yellow was usually willing to pay. Once in a while, however, an ant would ask for more money than Stephen Yellow could afford, and Stephen Yellow assessed it was simply less expensive to buy cheaper land from other neighboring ants, and then just built his roads around the home of the ant who was asking for more money than could be afforded. One ant in particular, Dr. Stanton Orange, who was actually Stephen Yellow's own bow-tie-clad physician, as luck would have it, was having such success with his medical practice that he didn't require any extra money. He was happy enough to walk the short distance to his office, and so he required no use for roads for his business to flourish. Thus, when Stephen Yellow's road company knocked on the door of Dr. Stanton Orange, offering the doctor payment if he would please sell a small portion of his property, the doctor, stubborn as ever, respectfully declined. "I don't need your money," explained Stanton Orange, "and I have no interest in helping you with your silly roads." The offer doubled and was again declined. After Stephen Yellow tripled the offer and was declined yet again, "I won't sell for any amount of money," the doctor had finally said. Stephen Yellow had no choice but to temporarily halt the construction of this particular road, which was to be a major thoroughfare between two populous areas of Ant Farm. The geography of this area did not allow for him to build the passage on surrounding lands. Needless to say, many ants, who now relied on travel by antimobiles, which they had also purchased covertly from Stephen Yellow's Antland contact, were very upset by this impediment. Many of these dismayed ants just happened to be patients of Dr. Stanton Orange, too. When they learned he was the reason for the gap in construction, they decided to boycott the good doctor, and instead visit Dr. Alan Cross, though more costly, or one of the single-spec doctors. Before long, Dr. Stanton Orange's once successful practice was now facing the possibility of going out of business. Reluctantly, his bow tie sagging, Dr. Stanton Orange decided his only viable choice at this time, in order to end the boycott, was to sell the desired piece of property to Stephen Yellow. After all, Dr. Stanton Orange could think of no legitimate reason why he had refused to sell this space anyway. He was just stubborn. However, Realizing Dr. Stanton Orange's now dire situation, Stephen Yellow knew he could, this time, offer far less money than he had initially offered. "Isn't it interesting," proclaimed Stephen Yellow, some mud on his left cheek, while signing the agreement with Dr. Stanton Orange, "that when I first came to you, I was willing to pay you 6 times this amount? Ants of freedom indeed." Dr. Stanton Orange didn't reply. He just gritted his teeth and signed the contract with this dirty yellow ant. But his anger didn't last very long. Within a week, most of his old patients had returned, and his bow tie looked sharper than ever. He was, after all, a great doctor, and had finally responded to the requests of his patients to allow roads to be built about his office. Within 2 weeks, he had also attracted additional customers, who could now access his office by automobile in a manner they had been unable to prior. One evening, while counting his gold specks from the day's work, realizing business now was better than ever, he acknowledged his folly. "What a fool I was for holding out in the first place." But he dared not admit this to any ant. He had far too much pride. Other boycotts and voluntary anti-competitive practices took place as well. The fledgling Blue Newspaper Company began purchasing several smaller newspaper companies in an effort to control all media on Ant Farm. But 2 small newspapers held out, and many ants, displeased with the Blue Newspaper Company's perceived unethical practices, instead patronized the 2 holdout companies until these 2 had almost enough customers to rival the Blue Company. On another occasion, Magenta Furniture purchased the only 2 other furniture companies on Ant Farm, and Magenta Furniture, now without competition, was able to increase prices substantially. But this phenomenon did not last for long, for within days, Christophant Rose, with coincidentally rosy cheeks, and the notoriously short-tempered Melanent Amber, noticed an opportunity here and started their own furniture companies, siphoning business away from Magenta Furniture. Additionally, when Antel Spotted's Road Company, a new competitive option to Stephen Yellow's upstart, allied with Louisant Maroon's grocery store chain, and spotted roads were built between communities linking homes only to Maroon grocery stores, the Blue Newspaper Company and other media outlets covered this collusion extensively, since a scandal is always guaranteed to sell newspapers. Upon learning of this miniature conspiracy, ants from other communities boycotted Spotted Roads and Maroon grocery stores. Both companies had no choice but to change their practices or else go out of business due to lack of revenue from paying customers. Adding pressure to their situation was the Cyan grocery chain. "I'm so confident in Cyan groceries," stated the health-conscious, upbeat Timothant Cyan in a press release, "that I will build roads not only connecting my grocery stores to the rest of Ant Farm, but also to my competitors, and I will offer the use of my roads entirely for free." Needless to say, business soon boomed for Cyan Groceries, and the costs of the free roads he offered were completely offset and dramatically overshadowed by the vast profits he collected. Timothy Cyan had more money, and thus more time to exercise now, one of his favorite pastimes. Indeed, on Ant Farm, scandalous business practices could be spotted every so often, but somehow, whether by boycott, media exposure, or another method entirely, innovative ants eventually countered these practices in the marketplace, almost every single time. Meanwhile, still other road companies were sprouting up too, sometimes offering routes to other areas, and sometimes running directly parallel to and beside yellow roads and spotted roads in an aggressive bid to attract business from yellow roads and spotted roads customers. "We're completely out of space to build roads on," proclaimed Ryant Crimson one afternoon, that forehead vein of his pulsating again. "Prices are going to skyrocket now. What are we going to do?" And so, Millicent Green, with her passive-aggressive smile, purchased the space above the homes of other ants, putting that problem to a quick halt. For this, she never felt any hesitation in patting herself on the back whenever the subject would arise in conversation. It was no secret she was proud. In fact, it was Millicent Green's roads that introduced another first on Ant Farm. This time, it was transponder technology. Ants simply needed to place a transponder, which the Green Road Company was offering for no charge, in their antmobiles, and then Green Road sensors would pick up each ant's road travel and bill them by courier later. Before long, Yellow roads abandoned their initial toll booth collection technology in favor of the new transponder phenomenon. So did pink roads and even gold roads. Spotted roads and beige roads, competing road companies as they were, even found it financially beneficial to sign treaties with one another, allowing for spotted customers to drive on beige roads for no additional charge, and vice versa. The spotted road company and the beige road company would then, behind the scenes, split their revenues accordingly. Occasionally, roads required maintenance and construction, but these matters were handled quickly, and usually at off-peak times, for no road company wanted their roads disabled for too long and then have to watch their customers spend gold specs on competing road services in the interim. Some road companies found they attracted more customers by introducing strict speeding rules on their roads, thus creating the perception of greater safety. Other road companies found they attracted more customers by introducing hardly any rules on their roads at all, thus creating the perception of faster travel time. Pink roads, in particular, strictly enforced, with their own on-road security force, a maximum speed limit of 60 kilometers per hour. Joanne Copper, with a glistening pendant, constructed of the metal of her namesake, always proudly affixed to her chest, preferred driving on these roads because even though it took her a longer amount of time to get from A to B, there were, statistically, fewer fatalities from automobile wrecks on pink roads, and Joanne Copper was extremely concerned with her own safety. Clancy Mauve, on the other hand, would always tell other ants, and always with his assistance of wild hand movements and gestures, that he much preferred to pay for the use of gold roads, where there were no speed limits, and where he was permitted to drive as fast as he wanted, he would explain, always with his left hand zipping from his chest outwards any time he said the word fast. Further, he paid less to use these roads than Joanne Copper paid to use pink roads, since pink roads had to hire that extensive on-road security force, and gold roads did not. It was true, statistically. He had a slightly higher chance of being killed by a negligent driver on gold roads, but he was willing to take this risk because he was able to travel from A to B much faster than if he were driving on pink roads, and it cost him less too. It quickly became clear which ants valued safety and which ants valued convenience and price in their own individual lives, and there was a road company to cater to almost every other need beyond just those two as well. In my old town back in that terrible nation of Great Antland, explained Dr. Alan Cross to one of his patients during a casual conversation after a physical examination, we had half as many ants, but thrice as much road traffic. I don't know exactly how they do things differently here, but whatever they're doing, I love it. To be sure, not all ants were honest, and not all ants had the best interests of other ants in mind. Some tried to cheat each other, and many tried to prevent others from succeeding. But without any state apparatus in place to initiate aggressive physical force, as had been the case back in Great Antland, the dishonest ants had a much tougher time blocking the success of their competitors. As an example, during the winter, Elizabeth Magenta, of the successful Magenta Furniture Company, her hammer always firmly affixed to her tool belt, started a side project, Magenta Antomobiles. She received additional funding from two wealthy petroleum company investors, who knew if she was pumping out automobiles, her customers would need to pump petroleum into those automobiles. However, Elizabeth Magenta soon discovered a new technology that would allow her company's automobiles to operate using electricitant, a far less expensive power source than the traditional petroleum that automobiles had used up until this point. Unfortunately, her petroleum investment companies threatened to pull their funding from her company if she proceeded to develop automobiles that would operate using electricitant, since this would undoubtedly mean less business for the petroleum companies. Scared to lose her funding, but knowing the new technology could potentially make her rich, she held a private meeting with the, now very wealthy, owner of the Gold Spec Company. "My friend, Mr. Jonathan Gold," she began, "they are trying to stop my new technology, but I know with your help we can do so much good for these ants and make so much money doing it." After viewing her presentation, Jonathan Gold wisely agreed to match and replace the investments from the petroleum companies. Magenta Automobiles proceeded with their electricitant-powered automobiles, and predictably, the petroleum companies pulled their funding, but, with new funding in place from the calculating Jonathan Gold, Magenta Automobiles remained unfazed. Quite the opposite, in fact. Magenta Automobiles, and their new investor, recorded record profits that quarter, and so did Rose Automobiles and Amber Automobiles, who also developed electricitant-powered automobiles, after seeing how successful Elizabeth Magenta had become, a new solid gold hammer now gracing her belt. Hundreds of new jobs were created, too. She had been right all along. The petroleum companies, on the other hand, took an immense financial hit. Even though they had been offered first dibs at the opportunity, their short-sightedness ultimately hurt their bottom line. By spring, with the new electricitant-powered automobiles flourishing, and other businesses and job opportunities sprouting up almost every day, Grant Brown, pencil on ear, decided it would be a good and profitable idea to begin collecting data, like population statistics, unemployment numbers, crime rates, and so forth, and to begin selling this data to interested parties. He even backtracked and gathered retroactive data, dating back to the very first day the ants had arrived on Ant Farm, shortly after the Exodus. The trends were undeniable. Colonies incapable of defending themselves would have become easy prey to predators. A colony whose members act together in defense, however, presents a formidable opponent. Klotz et al., 134. Chapter 3. Ant Farm Statistics, Rates per Thousand. Date, January 3, 1906. Population, 1,602. Average lifespan, 73 years. Unemployment, 1.29%. Total tax rate, 0.00%. Cost of one berry, 10 gold specks. Annual violent crime, 1. Annual nonviolent crime, 7. Several other ants were slowly sneaking out of Antland, singing Ants of Freedom along the way, having heard rumors that, so far at least, the quality of life on Ant Farm was far better than it had been in Great Antland for some time. One such ant, Christian Striped, just days after fleeing Antland and arriving at the Ant Farm, had already reestablished her career. In Antland, she had been a mail carrier and, incidentally, a chain smoker, employed by their government. Here at the Ant Farm, with no existing government to pay her, she set up her own courier service, Striped Delivery. She's still moonlit as a chain smoker, though. Just days since its inception, her new business was already drawing in more customers than Christian Striped could handle on her own. "What an immediate change in lifestyle," she exclaimed. "I almost can't believe how much better things are here, how much more purpose I now have in my life, and how much less miserable I've immediately become." Though barely through puberty, Christian Striped's young son, Andrew Striped, who would have been forbidden from working in Antland due to the nation's legally enforced age restrictions, volunteered to assist his beloved mother. In an effort to teach her son fiscal responsibility, Christian Striped decided to pay her son a small wage for his work, a wage he used to support his own chain smoking, which he hid quite effectively from his mother. Unfortunately, the morning after arriving on Ant Farm, and prior to hiring her son, Christian Striped rushed into Ryant Crimson's office with some disturbing news. "Ryant Crimson," she began in a panic, already out of breath, for obvious reasons, and flustered. "I have just fled from Antland, and I must inform you that Prime Minister Whut, that hideous, tyrannical cockroach, has been noticing more and more of us fleeing. This is upsetting him greatly, since many of his most productive ants are immigrating to Ant Farm. On more than one occasion, he has talked about assembling his army and invading Ant Farm. I'm scared, Ryant Crimson. What are we to do? We'll never survive." "Now calm down," replied Ryant Crimson, flexing his ever-growing arms. "You mean to tell me Great Antland is planning to invade us?" "Yes," she said, terrified. Immediately, angrily, Ryant Crimson picked up the telephant and gripped it firmly, almost crushing it by accident. First he called the tall, gangling Melvin Red of the Red Daily Press, so as to give his best friend first exposure to a whopper of a story. And then he called it Jantis Bronze of the Bronze Daily Standard. The next morning, both publications, and several others, were headlining the new threat from Great Antland, and many residents of Ant Farm were in a panic. Some ants stocked up on food, others fled Ant Farm entirely. Most ants, however, were resilient. They talked to representatives at their security companies to figure out what to do. Angela Navy's telephone, for one, was ringing off the hook. That night, after consulting with her close confidant, Williant Blue, who always seemed to offer great advice in high-pressure situations. She assembled the owners of all the local security companies at her office, including the colossal Riot Crimson. Here, a bit panicked herself, she gave a brief speech, tossing her ball in the air faster than usual. "I think we're going to have to work together to prepare against this threat," she said to Riot Crimson and the few others in the room with her. "Otherwise, we don't stand a chance. Working with all of you, my competitors, the very ants who want to put me out of business, certainly isn't my first choice here, and probably not yours either. But I don't see what other options we have if we want to survive what's coming." A consensus was reached. They would, indeed, have to work together. They signed agreements detailing how they would distribute the revenues from their clients, and then they began planning an armed defense strategy. The next morning, invoices were sent to the clients of every security company, noting a sharp increase in cost. A few ants either could not afford to pay or refused to pay, but most were eager to, even if it meant they would have to, hopefully temporarily, forego some of the more expensive luxuries they had grown to love. With this extra revenue, the security companies each hired additional skilled security representatives and bought extra materials to accommodate the vast numbers of additional volunteers that were also flooding in. Before long, when the security companies gathered together for coordinated training efforts, they appeared to be a small army themselves. It was a cold morning when the invasion came to their doorstep, but the security companies of Ant Farm were ready. The white cockroaches scurried in droves, squealing loudly as they neared, their disgusting arms frantically grinding against other disgusting arms, thin drops of bile dripping from their mouths. Armed to the teeth with weaponry they had, ironically, covertly purchased from ants within the confines of Great Antland itself, Ant Farm's hundreds of paid and volunteered security representatives stood strong and unified. So did several hundred additional civilian ants, who had no official connections to the security companies at all. These civilian ants were just personally armed, standing confidently at their own homesteads, ready to die to protect their families. It was one of Prime Minister Whut's sons, a general for the Great Antland Army, who fired the first shell. The battle was bloody, but the security companies of Ant Farm had secured a strong perimeter around all of their clients and some non-clients' property. They fought back, and they fought back hard against the larger, more vicious white cockroaches. Members of the Great Antland Army found themselves shocked at how well their enemies defended themselves, using new fighting techniques and strategies they had never seen before. Indeed, they were unsure of how to adjust. Great Antland's white cockroaches were fast being destroyed, and their corpses almost made for a more unpleasant sight than those cockroaches left unharmed. Meanwhile, several security ants and resident ants from Ant Farm were also perishing. But by the end of the battle, they had held their ground. Not a single non-combatant ant had been injured or killed. Sadly, 30 ants from Crimson, Navy, and other security companies lay dead on the battlefield, plus 12 additional Ant Farm residents who had taken it upon themselves to fight without financial compensation, just in an effort to guard their own personal homesteads. This, however, was a small number compared to the 300-plus Great Antland white cockroaches who had fallen, including Prime Minister Whut's son, the general. Word of defeat fast returned to Prime Minister Whut himself, as well as to his other surviving sons, and indeed, they all reacted with bitter outrage and loud vows of vengeance. Embarrassed, he publicly promised his thousands of Great Antland subjects his army would regroup, increase its size, and finish the job, but, for various reasons, ranging from dwindling morale to deteriorating supplies and everything in between, Prime Minister Whut's promise never came to fruition. Meanwhile, moments after the vast Ant Farm security companies had declared victory over the tyrannical white cockroaches, spontaneous celebrations broke out in the streets. They had won. 0 non-combatants had been harmed. They mourned the fallen ants, of course, some of whom were fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers of the protected ants. But nonetheless, there was a feeling of victory in the air, and choruses of ants of freedom could be heard across Ant Farm well into the wee hours of the night. "I could not be more proud," began Riot Crimson at a celebration that evening, "of how gallantly all of you fought. We showed them we have another way, a better way. My fellow ants, I propose a toast. To Ant Farm." His grin was wide, and he was not alone. The crowd cheered in reply. Weeks passed without further incident before most ants felt the threat from Great Antland was gone. When this happened, again on advice from Williant Blue, Angela Navy, now tossing her ball at a calmer pace again, lowered her security fees to what they had been before the war, and let some of her newly reinforced staff and volunteers go. Other security forces followed suit. Ryant Crimson, wanting desperately to keep his rates high, for he had just purchased a pricey new automobile, held his rates high until he could afford to no longer. Many of his clients were switching to the less expensive competitors. This created much tension in his frequently flexing muscles, still juiced with adrenaline from the battle weeks earlier. Even Melvin Red, his close confidant, gave some serious consideration to switching to a company that offered lower rates. Alas, Ryant Crimson finally gave in, his fist pounding hard on his desk, and he too lowered his rates in order to remain a viable, and still the largest, security company, much to the relief of Melvin Red, who would now not have to undergo the awkward action he had earlier contemplated, an action that may have well driven a wedge between him and his best friend. As if a war wasn't enough to bring perspective and peace to Ant Farm, just days later, another first occurred. A seemingly irresolvable dispute erupted between Pantrick Purple, the farmer, who was currently employing Ryant Crimson's security force for protection, and Cantasilver, the currency dealer, who had instead chosen to patronize the services of Angela Navy's security team. The dispute, specifically, was over a dozen berries Pantrick Purple had sold to Cantasilver. These berries rotted weeks earlier than Pantrick Purple had promised they would. In an attempt to solve the dispute, the two ants agreed to use the arbitration services of Madeline Black, of the newly formed Black Arbitration Company, the only arbitration company established on Ant Farm so far. Cantasilver and Pantrick Purple voluntarily consented, in advance of the arbitration process, that the losing ant would be obligated to pay the arbitration fees, in addition to any additional money owed for lost property. Madeline Black was one of the most respected ants on the farm, partially due to her size, which rivaled many of the white cockroaches, but mostly this admiration was earned from the respect she herself afforded other ants, quite unlike the white cockroaches. After a few days of considering the evidence and testimony, Madeline Black ruled in favor of Cantasilver and ordered Pantrick Purple to either refund the money to Cantasilver or else hand over to Cantasilver a new batch of a dozen berries. Certainly, it was not a first occurrence on the ant farm for Madeline Black to arbitrate over a dispute. However, it was the first time an ant, Pantrick Purple in this case, chose to ignore Madeline Black's ruling, chewing hard on his twig in defiance. "This is an outrage," blurted Pantrick Purple once the verdict was announced. "Normally, I have immense esteem for you, Madeline Black, but this is ridiculous. I wholeheartedly disagree with your decision. I will never pay. And in this land, thank goodness, there is no gruesome white cockroach army to make me." That much was true, but there was another way. Cantasilver, usually quick-witted and comedic, had lost her sense of humor on this particular day. She called her security company and spoke directly to Angela Navy, who assembled a small team of her staff to pay Pantrick Purple a visit with the intention of extracting, by defensive force, to counter Pantrick Purple's aggressive initiation of fraud, if necessary, the payment Madeline Black had ordered. Pantrick Purple was really only armed with a rake, but Angela Navy figured her team would be able to resolve this dispute in no time flat, and certainly without injury to any party. As a good friend always does, Williant Blue, waddling along, accompanied Angela Navy and her team to Pantrick Purple's homestead. But when they arrived, they were, quite unexpectedly, met by Pantrick Purple's paid security force. The hulking Ryant Crimson and his team stood guard, accompanied by the loyal, though comparatively unimpressive, Melvin Red. "Your client," explained Angela Navy, weapons drawn, ball firmly in hand, "owes our client payment." "Our client," replied Ryan Crimson, weapons drawn, gritting his teeth, his clenched jaw leaking out words, "is paying us to protect him from ants like you, who would take his assets without his permission." "Madeline Black already ruled on this matter. Are you ready to die for your client?" asked Angela Navy. "Madeline Black isn't always right. Are you ready to die for yours?" rebutted Ryan Crimson. The two lurked outside Pantrick Purple's homestead in classic standoff fashion for some time. What were they to do? Angela Navy turned to her confidant, Williant Blue, but kept one eye on Ryant Crimson just in case. They muttered to one another for about an hour, trying to find a reasonable solution. Simultaneously, Ryant Crimson whispered ideas to Melvin Red, careful to keep his voice low so his competitor could not hear the discussion. Eventually, Angela Navy dropped her weapon and her ball to the ground and proposed a new idea, out loud, back to Ryant Crimson. "Pitting your forces against mine," she began, "even if you defeat us, will surely cost your company a lot of money, yes? I ask because it will cost our company great resources to fight yours, even if we defeat you." Ryant Crimson chuckled loudly at that notion. "To make up these costs," continued Angela Navy, "both of us will have to increase our monthly subscription fees to our other clients who, I should add, are still fiscally worn down from the war price hike we only recently dropped. This would surely allow for one of the smaller security forces to offer comparatively lower rates and likely steal most of our clientele. I don't want that. Do you?" Ryant Crimson replied, "Of course not. Don't be absurd." "Well then," continued Angela Navy, "I propose we collectively poll our clients." "Poll them about what?" asked Ryant Crimson. "Well, I think we can agree both your clients and my clients have great respect for Madeline Black and her decisions, right?" "Yes, but so what?" "Even though you have more clients than I," Angela Navy replied, "I propose we ask our clients what they would like us to do about the situation. Then we will pool the results, and if the majority of our clients together decide Pantrick Purple should not have to pay, then I will abandon our effort to collect from him." Ryant Crimson was a bit stunned she might agree to give up so easily. He knew there was a catch. "But what if they decide Pantrick Purple should pay?" he asked. "If that's the outcome, then you will agree to back off." There was the catch indeed, but it was, at least, a fair catch. "If my clients don't like this arrangement," she continued, "well, I guess they can start using a different security company, and I will suffer those consequences. Do you agree to this, Ryant Crimson?" He thought about this arrangement for a few minutes, but in the end, he knew it was the best option he had heard so far. Still, he hesitated a long while before responding, his ego bruised by the fact that if he didn't agree to something resembling Angela Navy's proposal, he would surely lose clients, and he would not be able to do anything to stop this. Out of desperation, he finally called back, "Is there no other way?" "I can't think of any," replied Angela Navy. "Nor can I," said William Blue across the field next to Angela Navy. A pause. "Nor can I," chimed Melvin Red, standing right next to Ryant Crimson, catching him a little off guard. Wasn't this his advisor, agreeing with the competition? Was Melvin Red being disloyal? Or was he simply recognizing the truth? This was the only reasonable solution. Finally, Ryant Crimson loosened his body and responded, slowly, reluctantly. "Very well," he said, defeated. "I agree." They resolved to settle the details in the morning. He sighed. The next day, Angela Navy and Ryant Crimson sat down, and together they created a ballot to send to all of their clients. William Blue and Melvin Red eagerly assisted them with the wording. By the end-of-week ballot deadline, only 2/3 of the ballots were returned, since some of the ants just didn't care to vote, and the results, printed on the front page of every media outlet, read as follows. 92% of respondents agree that Navy protection must collect payment from Pantrick Purple without interference from Crimson Security in accordance with the ruling by black arbitration. 8% of respondents agree that Navy protection must not collect payment from Pantrick Purple, contradictory to the ruling by black arbitration. 0% of respondents agree that Navy protection and Crimson Security must engage in combat to settle the matter, thus tripling monthly client security fees, contradictory to the ruling by black arbitration. Even though, deep down, Ryant Crimson had known in advance this was likely to be the outcome of the poll, because Madeline Black held such an honorable reputation on the farm, he still took a step back when he saw this landslide poll result. He briefly considered ignoring the ruling to save face, and destroying Angela Navy's security company anyway. But Melvin Red reminded him, in no uncertain terms, this would be economic suicide. Then, reminded Melvin Red, his own clients would surely regard him as a murderer and seek security from one of the up-and-comers. Indeed, Melvin Red was fast becoming something of a valuable business advisor to Ryant Crimson. What he lacked in strength, he made up for in wisdom, not to mention height. And so, on November 13th, 1907, Angela Navy and her team marched right into Patrick Purple's homestead and took payment from him to cover the cost of a refund to Cantus Silver, plus interest, as well as payment to Madeline Black, plus interest, as well as payment to Ryan Crimson, plus interest, as well as payment to Angela Navy, plus interest. William Blue, short and smug, shot Patrick Purple a quick smirk, as if to say, "I told you so." Patrick Purple, at least, still had his rake, which he clenched tightly, as ants seized much of his other property. He was not pleased, but he saw this coming. Noticing it surely frustrated Cantus Silver, Madeline Black, Ryan Crimson, and Angela Navy to have to wait such a long time to finally collect the money they were owed, it was a smart, wealthy, young, no-nonsense ant by the name of Clancy Mauve who started a brand new business called Mauve Antsurance. Always chuckling loudly, and with that funny manner of speaking with his hands, he was very persuasive. For a very small monthly fee, he explained with a tiny, pinching hand gesture, any ant can purchase one of my Mauve Antsurance policies. Then, if such an ant is ever owed money after an arbitration ruling is issued, Mauve Antsurance will immediately pay this money directly to the creditor and then collect it from the debtor at a later date. Because Clancy Mauve's rates were so low, hundreds and hundreds of ants purchased policies. It was rare that Mauve Antsurance ever had to pay out on a policy, but when they did, it was a relatively large amount. Fortunately for Mauve Antsurance, the company was collecting such a large amount in monthly fees that a policy payout never hurt enough to put a significant dent in their business. Meanwhile, Patrick Purple, himself now a policyholder of Mauve Antsurance, was in a real bind. For some time, many ants didn't feel right buying any berries from Patrick Purple, knowing the trouble he had caused, as the only ant to ever ignore a ruling from black arbitration. At one point, when no ants would buy anything from him as part of a boycott, all he had left was his rake and his twig. With time, most eventually forgave him. He had, after all, settled up with everyone he owed money to, even if it had to be extracted by force. Slowly, his business increased, although he never quite made a full recovery. Needless to say, a lesson was learned by all on Ant Farm from this experience. Never again did any of them witness an armed standoff between two security companies. Angela Navy and Ryan Crimson had found a better way, but not the only way. Some other security companies handled disputes differently and lost clients, and other companies handled disputes differently still and won clients. As a result, with the population on Ant Farm continuing to grow, so did the number of security forces and arbitration services and insurance companies and delivery squads and charity foundations and automobile manufacturers and farming concerns and road businesses and theater companies and every other venture the ants could imagine, each with its own take on how these services ought to be offered. If an ant was willing to pay for a product or service, that very ant, if intuitive enough, or a different, more enterprising ant, as the case often was soon there to fill that gap and reap the profits. Anton Indigo and Antria Violet, who had first motivated the ants towards exodus and the development of a free society, both watched, pleased, and continued their own respective businesses. Anton and his own wife had taken up work as novelists, while Antria Violet served as a stage actor, her own husband staying at home to take care of their many children. To be fair, Ant Farm was no utopia. Some ants fell sick, some ants grew poor. Yet most of the sick or poor ants, who could not afford basic life necessities, were cared for through donations from charitable organizations or directly from their neighbors. Sickness and poverty never even came close to what it had been in Great Antland, where that nation's government worked very hard and heavy-handedly to fight those two plagues. Rather, here on Ant Farm, when Patrick Purple found himself on the brink of financial ruin for that stunt he had pulled involving Cantus Silver and the rotten berries, it was Janant Mauve, Clancy Mauve's older sister from down the road, as it turned out, who offered a helping hand, because Patrick Purple had been such a close friend for so many years. A few months later, it was Janant Mauve who was in need, and with Patrick Purple's business now back on track, more or less, he was happy to assist. Other compassionate ants also lent a helping hand when they could. Jantifer Turquoise, a very religious and compassionate ant, started the Turquoise Charity Company and noticed immediately that resident ants came knocking on her door to donate money for less fortunate ants. Jantifer Turquoise, a religious amulet always dangling from her neck, cherished the self-righteousness she felt as she distributed this money according to her company's standards, keeping a small amount to pay herself and her employees in order to cover their own living expenses. She was proud. Her company was very careful to avoid distributing funds to those ants who really didn't need it. She didn't want her donors to think their donations were going to waste on ants who could actually provide for themselves. Fraud occurred seldom, and the donors remained relatively happy. The frail Jonathan Gold was among the first of these donors, and he began with a hefty donation, partly out of his own compassion, and partly because he knew it would attract good publicity, wise as he was. "Thank you so much," said Jantifer Turquoise upon receiving this large donation, "but I don't recall your ever donating a single speck back in Antland. Why did you have this sudden change of heart?" "It's not really a change of heart," replied Jonathan Gold. "Rather, in Antland, the white cockroaches kept telling us they had to confiscate our wealth so they could provide charity to less fortunate. They left me with the impression they were helping the poor, so I didn't feel like I had to." He continued, "Here on Ant Farm, if ants like me don't help out, I know that nobody will." And other ants certainly helped out too. However, some ants soon became skeptical about the Turquoise Charity Company. Was this company keeping too high a percentage of donations, 10% as it were, for their own pockets? From this question sprang the founding of the Pink Charity Company, which upheld a donation rate of 95%, competing with Turquoise's 90%. Others soon followed too, slightly edging out even Pink's donation rates. Turquoise Charity was soon forced to adjust its own policies if it wanted to remain the most dominant force in the charity industry. As a result, with all of these new charity companies vying for donations and competing with newer and more efficient ways to distribute them, very few ant farm residents ever went hungry or without medical care. Some still suffered, to be sure, but far fewer than had suffered in Antland. No, things were not perfect, but, by and large, the standard of living was high. It was not until summer that Ryant Crimson, leader of the first and most successful security firm, with good friend Melvant Red standing tall by his side, called for a community assembly, a town hall meeting as he called it, with the type of request the residents of Ant Farm had not heard since their days back in Great Antland, days that were fast becoming distant memories from many months ago. Once eusocial species reached a more advanced stage, with large colonies and specialized worker subcastes, the rules changed. Holdobler and Wilson, 196. Chapter 4. Ant Farm Statistics, Rates per Thousand. Date, July 16, 1909. Population, 1,955. Average lifespan, 74 years. Unemployment, 1.22%. Total tax rate, 0.00%. Cost of one berry, 9 gold specks. Annual violent crime, 2. Annual nonviolent crime, 6. Many ants gathered at the central ant square, which happened to be part of Ryant Crimson's large homestead property. He generously kept the central ant square open all times, for any public visitor to enjoy. Tonight, though, he had other motives, besides just leisure, at this town hall meeting. He first conducted a chorus of Ants of Freedom, and then began to speak, once a hush fell about the crowd. "My fellow ants," he proclaimed, hands open to the skies, arms flexed with power, "I shall get straight to the point of my calling all of you here. I have seen much greatness since the Exodus, since we first established our new free society, absent of the tyranny the hideous white cockroaches used to inflict upon all of us. To reinforce the reason all of us chose to live here, I have taken it upon myself to draft a limited constitution which embodies our way of living." At this time he pointed to a wooden wall in the square, upon which was carved the following inscription. Limited Constitution. 1. No ant shall initiate aggressive physical force or fraud against any other ant. Great cheering swept about the ants. Anton Indigo and Andrea Violet, adjusting her glasses, remained quiet, concerned there might be more to come from Ryant Crimson. They were correct. Additionally, he continued, the crowd still bubbling with joy and excitement, there is another reason why I have summoned all of you here today. Most of you already pay for my security services, and for this I am grateful, and you are safer. A few chuckles from the crowd. Some of you still insist on using Navy, and I should point out their reputation for customer safety is not as good as mine, but this is beside the point. More important, there are still a few of you who insist on not patronizing any security force at all. I need not remind you of the great threat Great Antland posed to us not long ago, and may pose to us again sometime in the future. But I should remind you all there was a murder here last year, committed by an ant within the very borders of Ant Farm itself. Ryant Crimson omitted the fact that the murder victim was one of his own clients, rather than an ant who chose to protect himself with his own personal weapons. Murder, dear ants. How can we tolerate such a heinous crime in our superior society? How can we let the poorer ants, who cannot afford Crimson security, Navy protection, or one of the others, suffer the potentially life-threatening consequences of their meager financial situations? A hush. I propose we cannot. We aren't cruel, heartless slave masters like the disgusting white cockroaches of Great Antland. Most of you are earning a more than livable wage, yes? Tonight, then, I propose a vote on the following plan. Crimson Security Forces will, henceforth, be the exclusive protection company of Ant Farm, and will protect all ants from harm. Gasps amongst the crowd. Of course, we will, some reluctance from Ryant Crimson, now gritting his teeth, absorb Navy and their staff into our organization and ensure they are paid no less than they have already been earning. Angela Navy looked over to William Blue and let out a sigh of relief at this notion as she continued to toss her ball up and down. I have an objection, bellowed Anton Indigo from the center of the crowd, loudly but calmly, without any sign of anger. It is not your time to speak, retorted Melvin Red, towering over the other ants, upholding the rules of his good friend. Let him speak, cried an anonymous ant from the crowd. It's Anton Indigo, cried another. Let him speak, belted out another ant. Before long, dozens of ants were hollering over each other, and the consensus was clear. They wanted Anton Indigo to speak. Ryant Crimson looked nervously from side to side, embarrassed his grand physical stature couldn't shake the entire crowd, the way it had shaken individual ants he had detained over the past year during crime investigations. Finally, glancing at Melvant Red for moral support, he wavered and invited Anton Indigo to the podium. I ask each of you sitting here today, began Anton Indigo, does this not sound like the beginning of a slippery slope towards the paralyzing life of government monopolization, taxation, and regulation most of you, new boards excluded, fled from less than 5 years ago? Nonsense, interjected Ryant Crimson. A call for safety is hardly paralyzing, as you put it. We would ask only for less than 1% of each ant's total income to pay for this. By gosh, that's less than many of you are already paying, and a far cry from the 77% income tax most of us paid in Antland under the bitter rule of Antony Leopold White and the other disgusting white cockroaches. It is utter nonsense to compare the two. It's only been minutes since you announced the first rule of your limited constitution, and already you propose breaking it? Is coercive, mandatory, involuntary taxation not oppressive, no matter how large or small the amounts may be, and no matter what its purpose is? Asked Anton Indigo. Listen to yourself, Anton Indigo, interjected Melvin Red mockingly in defense of his friend. Involuntary, you say? Oppressive? Ryant Crimson is hardly Antony White. The former is proposing a vote, dear friend, not a decree. And then, turning his attention back to the crowd, surely the more intelligent ants amongst you can see the difference between Ryant Crimson and a certain despotic, insidious white cockroach we all remember? Ryant Crimson, I know your intentions are, but Anton Indigo was cut off by more screams from the crowd. Let us vote on it, they cried. And isn't it our choice, Anton Indigo? And we are civilized here, amongst others. And before Anton Indigo could continue again, Ryant Crimson was back in control, and Melvin Red shot the Indigo ant a satisfied smirk. It is settled then, Ryant Crimson proclaimed. We shall vote on this matter like any truly free nation should. I would like to propose an amendment to that vote, please, squealed Jantifer Turquoise from the crowd, her religious amulet bouncing and jingling as she rose. Similarly, most ants here contribute to my turquoise charity fund, which has proved invaluable in assisting some of the less fortunate ants. However, collecting donations from so many ants causes my staff much time and aggravation. Since most are already paying anyway, as we are still the #1 charity firm in this land, we should collect a small charity fee from all ants on Ant Farm, similar to the security fee you propose. We all stand to benefit here, don't we? More amendments were also proposed, and before long, despite objections from competing charity companies, plus some other concerned ants, they all found themselves voting on 4 resolutions. A 0.50 income security fee was passed by a vote of 52% to 48%. A 0.30 income charity fee was passed by a vote of 53% to 47%. A 1.10 income road fee was rejected by a vote of 56% to 44%. A 1.05 income judicial system fee, which would have replaced black arbitration and its few competitors that had recently arisen, was also rejected by a vote of 51% to 49%. By the end of the Central Square meeting, then, 2 additional inscriptions had been adorned on the wooden wall of the square, detailing the new annual fees to be donated voluntarily. 2. All ants must donate a small security fee. 3. All ants must donate a small charity fee. Together, Bryant Crimson and Melvin Red roused up the ants to sing Ants of Freedom one final time before the gathering was officially adjourned. It was exhilarating. A few weeks later, Anton Indigo was buying groceries at his local supermarket and bumped into Angela Navy in the produce aisle. She gently tossed a piece of berry up and down as she shopped efficiently through the lanes, a fine temporary replacement for her usual ball. "Why, Anton Indigo," began Angela Navy, "it is, indeed, a pleasure to see you here today, but I must comment I was a little confused about your words at Central Ant Square when we added rules to the limited constitution. Specifically, you were trying to convey that you consider the new rules with the intention of helping ants, not hurting them, to be equivalent to initiating aggressive physical force. The way I see it, nothing could be further from the truth." "Well," responded Anton Indigo, quickly checking his wristwatch to ensure he indeed had the available time to broach this subject. He did. "Let's use your new rule about the small security fee as an example. Do you acknowledge that I have never explicitly agreed to adhere to this rule?" "Well, yes," she replied. "I'm quite sure you either voted against it or else you didn't vote at all." "And, may I ask, if I refuse to pay this security fee, am I initiating fraud against any ant?" "No," she replied, "since we all know fraud requires you to break an agreement that you agreed to." "And, may I ask, if I refuse to pay this security fee," he continued, calm as ever, "am I initiating aggressive physical force against any ant?" She considered the question for a few moments. "No," she replied. "Well then, if I refuse to pay the security fee, still not initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ants, as you say, then will Ant Farm Security initiate aggressive physical force against me?" "Of course not," replied Angela Navy. "We aren't vicious brutes like the terrifying white cockroach militia of Great Antland. If you refuse to pay, we would only issue a small fine as penalty." "And, may I ask, if I refuse to pay the small fine, am I initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant?" "Well, no, I guess," she replied. "Well then, if I refuse to pay the small fine, still not initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant, as you say, then will Ant Farm Security initiate aggressive physical force against me?" "Dear Anton Indigo," she replied, "of course not. I just finished telling you we are not repugnant white cockroach thugs. If you refuse to pay the small fine, we will bring you to arbitration and let an impartial judge rule on the case." "And, may I ask, if I refuse to go to arbitration over this matter, am I initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant?" "No," she replied with greater hesitation this time, her berry toss slowing in pace. "Well then, if I refuse to go to arbitration, still not initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant, as you say, then will Ant Farm Security initiate aggressive physical force against me?" "Of course not," she replied, beginning to become noticeably frustrated with his repetitive line of questioning, though his voice still remained soft. "In that case, we would send some of our staff members to your home and take you with us to arbitration." "And, may I ask, if I refuse to go to arbitration with your staff members, am I initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant?" "No!" This time, she clearly sounded upset, beginning to notice the redundancy of her own replies. She had not noticed, but Anton Indigo did. Her berry tossing had ceased. "Well then, if I refuse to go to arbitration with your staff members, still not initiating fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant, as you say, then will Ant Farm Security initiate aggressive physical force against me? In that case, she began, we would only use minimal force to physically take you to arbitration. Minimal force, dear friend. Wouldn't that minimal force still be Ant Farm Security initiating aggressive physical force against me, an ant who has not initiated fraud or aggressive physical force against anyone? She didn't reply, but she didn't have to. They both knew the answer. And, may I ask, if I refuse to go to arbitration with your staff members and only use my own defensive physical force against your initiation of aggressive physical force, strictly to avoid being taken from my home by your staff members without my permission, then what would happen to me next? In that case, she began, this time with more anger in her voice, feeling a touch of vengeful in Anton Indigo for even suggesting he would dare go against their compassionate system, our staff members would continue with their physical force against you and either render you unconscious and take you to our holding cell, or else, if you fought back viciously enough, well then you would kill me, interjected Anton Indigo. Again, Angela Navy didn't respond, but they both knew it was true. Therefore, continued Anton Indigo, still calmly and quietly, in this example, and in any example concerning your rules I do not agree to, I would never initiate fraud or aggressive physical force against any ant, the main principle upon which we all unanimously founded this new society, the very definition of the word peace. Yet eventually, despite my repeated non-initiation of fraud or aggressive physical force, your staff members would cage me or kill me. Breaking these rules is peaceful. Cheating nobody and hurting nobody. Refusing to pay these fines is peaceful. Cheating nobody and hurting nobody. Refusing to be judged over these matters is peaceful. Cheating nobody and hurting nobody. And yet, you would advocate breaking that peace and hurting me. This was not a question, but rather a statement of fact. The two stared at each other for a moment longer. That is the reason why, continued Anton Indigo, checking his watch once again, I will never support these measures or any future measures that are similar in nature. Anton Indigo placed 2 berry pieces in his shopping cart and proceeded down the produce aisle. This resemblance has been studied by sociologists who have also been able to point to detailed coincidences and analogies between human and animal parasitism in general. Wheeler, 503. Chapter 5. Haha! Fooled you! I'm not actually going to be reading Chapter 5 right now. I promised you 4 chapters for free, so there you go. But I hope you found those first 4 chapters interesting and that you want to find out what happens in the rest of the book. If so, please visit StephenAaronGray.com or AntFarmBook.com. Again, this is the first book I've ever had published, so I'd really appreciate it if you continue to support my cause by purchasing the full book and learning more about this philosophy that's so important to me. As you'll see, my book is really just an introduction to the ideas of liberty. I've intentionally not included any hard data here. But if you find it interesting, I hope you'll seek out more information on the subject, just as I've been doing. Well, thanks again, everybody. Peace out for now.